Okay, so now that we have looked at some of the cross-national differences in individualism and collectivism as value systems, let's just do a quick kind of correlation-based analysis on how those value systems affect things like the distribution of income and wealth, as you might have kind of been presuming when you heard some of the descriptors of individualism and collectivism off the previous slides. These are connected to social structure, and they have implications for how decisions get made about the structure of the economy, the political system, and society in general. So I want to do a quick kind of anecdotal correlation-based analysis here, looking at how those value systems kind of track with levels of social inequality. So what we have here, excuse me, let me go ahead and move my head for you, are some data on levels of income inequality in the same countries that I showed you earlier, except of course the data previously was on individualism. Now we're seeing data on income inequality. This data is pulled from the CIA World Factbook. Just a quick note on the data. Data on income inequality is notoriously difficult to procure. There are many reasons why a state or state actors or the government in a given state would like to manipulate the data on the gap between rich and poor, as you can imagine, obscure the data, not report it, and in some cases this is simply due to lack of resources or lack of political will. So, with that being said, we have to kind of qualify the data and think about it in that context. Much of the data gets reported periodically, many years apart, so we may not see kind of consistent yearly data on inequality. But the indicator that's used most often to discuss income inequality is referred to as the Gini index, sometimes also referred to as the Gini coefficient. So this can be looked at as a coefficient, meaning it ranges from 0 to 1 in value, or as an index ranging from 0 to 100. Either way, we're getting the same kind of picture. It just depends on personal preference. Just a quick tutorial on Gini index itself. The Gini index ranges from, if we're using it as an index, from 0 to 100. 0 is an ideal type, and this would be a society with perfect equality. So this would be a society where everyone has equal income. There are no differences in income between individuals within a society that has a 0 for a Gini index or coefficient. And of course, the upper range is 100. So that upper limit of 100 is an ideal type as well. Fortunately, it doesn't exist either. And this is a society where one individual has all income or has captured all income, and all other members of that society have no income at all. So it's a total inequality, perfect inequality. So all societies range between 0 and 100. Just to give you an idea, the lowest kind of large-scale state, or the lowest scoring a large-scale state on the Gini index is often Sweden or Norway, sometimes Finland, but usually a Nordic country. Sweden's Gini coefficient or Gini index was 23.9. 23.9 in 2014 when the data was reported. The countries that tend to have the highest level of income inequality are Southern African states, so South Africa itself, but also Lesotho, Namibia, Mozambique, and other states that, Zimbabwe, other states in Southern Africa that have had a history of apartheid-like systems, or some form of white minority rule, and that often today suffer from high levels of political corruption. Just a quick kind of backstory there on income inequality in Rome. But in this sample, you see that the United States has the highest Gini index. It's 45. in this, at least in this selected sample. You have Italy with a Gini index that's a bit higher at 41. I believe it's 41.6. Japan is showing a score of 37.7, and Ethiopia shows a score of 33.2 for Gini index. So, just kind of to toggle back to our individualism data, excuse me, of course the trend aligns here. So we have a correlation, of course, between individualism and income inequality. We could say that those two things are related if this were the only data that we were examining. But of course, if we did an exhaustive analysis with all of the data available, we might not find as strong of a correlation here. There are exceptions to the rule. There are highly individualistic states that have lower levels of inequality, and those that are more collectivistic, like China, that actually have higher levels of inequality. So, China, for instance, has higher income inequality, or about the same level of income inequality, depending on the data source, than does the United States. Okay. So next up, we are moving into a discussion of Max Weber's work, published in 1904, called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Max Weber is one of the founders of sociology, his work is not only widely read in sociology, but in other social sciences as well. And the Protestant Ethic is one of the most popular writings that Weber put forth in his career. And Max Weber is writing about Protestantism, specifically, I should say. So for those of you who are not familiar with Protestantism, Protestantism is one of the three main branches of Christianity. Those three branches would be Protestantism, Catholicism, and Orthodox Christianity. Of course, within each of those branches, you do see kind of sub-branches or sub-sects, but of course for our analysis we really only need to be able to distinguish between Protestantism and the other two main branches of Christianity. And of course Protestantism becomes a unique Christian sect during the mid-1500s as the Protestant Reformation is occurring, and Protestants are kind of breaking away from the Catholic Church and bucking some of the strictures of the Catholic Church, and really qualitatively changing the way that religion is carried out in Europe, and then concomitantly around the rest of the world, because those religions are of course global religions. And so Max Weber is really interested in the connection between a value system, individualism, a religion, Protestantism, and an economic system, capitalism. And what's the connection between those, and how do they kind of influence one another? So this is the question that he sought to investigate. So we might say something like, why did Protestant Europe industrialize and adopt capitalism earlier than other areas? So we do see kind of anecdotally, doing a historical analysis, that Protestant areas of Europe, areas of England where lots of Protestants resided, areas of Northern Europe that tended to be more heavily Protestant, such as the Netherlands, did industrialize earlier and more rapidly than other areas of Europe that were characterized by higher proportions of Catholics, such as Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, these types of places. So, Weber is noticing this, and he's wondering if the connection has to do with the religion itself. So, in order to kind of think about the connection between Protestantism and capitalism, industrialization, of course, one of the byproducts of capitalism, we have to think about what makes Protestantism unique. And Weber does this by comparing Protestantism with many other religions, not only Catholicism, but also Islam, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, Hinduism, and so in Confucianism, sorry. So, he does an exhaustive analysis looking at some of the distinctions of Protestantism and how it might be related to the development of capitalism. And some of the distinctions that he outlines are that Protestants are able to directly communicate with their higher power in a way that is usually not available to Catholics. So Catholics, for instance, are expected to attend regular religious services in order to commune with God or higher power. They would need to use an intermediary. In this case, it would be a priest. Protestantism eliminates that barrier. So Protestantism is a kind of religious sect where individuals can directly commune with God through the religious text, so in this case, the Bible. Protestantism also has the distinction of an emphasis on human action as a way to salvation. So to contrast this with Catholicism, Catholicism might emphasize piousness, so religious devotion, the frequency of kind of religious ritual or practice as kind of markers of one's devotion and ultimately one's likelihood of being saved. Now, of course, the Catholic Church was also widely criticized for kind of turning salvation into a commercial enterprise by selling ablutions to those, essentially forgiveness for their sins to those who are willing to pay for it, and of course this is one of the motivations for the Protestant breakaway. But in Protestantism, one's actions, one's agency, meaning their abilities, are actually the way that one achieves salvation. So in this case, hard work, working every day, devoting yourself to a task, is in and of itself, right, serving God. Asceticism means not over-consuming. It means kind of being economical. It means not displaying wealth conspicuously. And, although this may not seem directly related to capitalistic values and orientations, what we're getting at here is that actually if you're not over-consuming, if you're not wrapped up in conspicuous consumption or the pursuit of it, then an individual can save, right, and potentially invest and earn returns on their investment. So asceticism is associated with kind of frugality, investment, and essentially an accumulation of capital. Protestantism in general, at least according to Weber, this may not be true of contemporary Protestant sects and groups, but there is this kind of discouragement of charity. So Weber argues that where Catholics are kind of invested in helping the poor and establishing charities and kind of giving to those who need it or who are needy. The Protestants are less interested in that there's a kind of general negative stigma attached with charity. And interestingly enough, this is not out of a kind of lack of compassion for those who are suffering, but this is connected actually with one of the previous points. So the idea here is that charity might incentivize idleness, that it might discourage someone from going out and working, engaging in human action as their pathway to salvation by creating a kind of safety net that they can rely upon. So discouraging charity not only serves that function of kind of motivating, right, individuals to strive for greater success, but also, just like asceticism, it's associated with greater capital accumulation of the individual and a kind of concentration of wealth and resources in individuals and in families. Also, Protestantism, according to Weber, is going to allow for the questioning of authority and is more tolerant of non-conformity. So this is where you start to see some of the kind of individualism that characterizes Protestantism as opposed to Catholicism. And this is something that's been documented, I mean individualism in Protestantism, not only by Weber, but also by Durkheim. Of course, you read about Durkheim's suicide studies in the previous chapter. And finally, excuse me, Weber argues that Protestantism has no restrictions or constraints on the harnessing of nature, and this is actually seen as serving God or a higher power, according to Weber. So what this does is kind of open up the possibility of resource extraction, of environmental degradation that is so characteristic of the capitalist system today, and could be contributing to phenomena like climate change and other kind of negative processes. But of course, this is distinct from other religious systems. For instance, many Native American religious systems include constraints on harnessing nature, an emphasis on sustainability of nature, and a general discouragement of using natural resources for personal gain. So Protestantism has no restriction like that. And of course, this is highly complementary or highly related to capitalist modes of production. So what we do see in societies that have this or are characterized by a high level of this Protestant ethic, so societies like England or parts of the United Kingdom that are highly Protestant, societies like the United States, where lots of folks with Protestant backgrounds reside, are that we see a much higher level of individualism. We tend to see an emphasis on secular rational values, so as opposed to religious values or traditional values. In Protestant societies, we tend to see an emphasis on the logical, the rational, the scientific, the empirical, which once again is quite complementary to capitalism, which relies upon kind of rationalism and logic to a very high degree. Weber also argues that this Protestant ethic, because it's a part of a value system, it kind of creates a justification for the pursuit of material wealth at all costs, including environmental degradation and potentially exploitation of your fellow human or one's fellow human. So, the Protestant ethic, of course, is not heartless or lacking moral or something like that, but in its aggressive individualism is a perspective that does validate the accumulation of capital through the pursuit of material wealth. And ultimately, what this kind of results in is a value system mix that is conducive to and complementary to capitalism as an economic system, and industrialism or industrialization as a process that supports capitalism. So Weber's main premise is, in fact, that if we want to understand why capitalism developed in certain Protestant areas before other areas, and maybe understand why those places, like the United States or the United Kingdom, have such high levels of inequality today, we actually need to look at the value systems that have formed there over centuries.